Good morning, and welcome everyone to the final day of the BEST Summit. My name is Gerta Bardoshi, and I serve as the Director of Research and Training for the Iowa Center for School Mental Health. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jacob Priest. Jacob is an associate professor and the director of the Couple and Family Therapy Program at the University of Iowa. He also serves as a director of the LGBTQ Counseling Clinic, has an appointment in the Department of Psychiatry, and has a private practice at the Counseling Center of Iowa City. He's a frequent contributor to Iowa Public Radio. His work has been featured on outlets such as CNN and Nat Geo Kids, and he's the co-host of the Attached podcast. Jacob is the author of The Science of Family System Theory and more than 30 scientific publications. He lives in Cedar Rapids, Iowa with his wife Chelsea, and his son Keenan, and 5 cats: Albert, Louie, Woodward, Lyndon, and Cecilia. Other than being an outstanding mental health professional,
I still got my walk-up music, so that's good. Good morning. I'm happy you're here. It's the last day of the conference at 9 a.m. And most of the conferences I go to, this is the hardest session to get to. But hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun this morning. Hopefully we'll learn a little bit. But before I jump in, I want to tell you a little bit about me and who I am to set the stage. So as Gerta, Dr. Bardoshi introduced me, I'm faculty at the University of Iowa. One thing she didn't mention that I want to talk about is I'm also an affiliate faculty in the Iowa Center for School Mental Health. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Brun, Dr. Vogelgesang, Dr. Bardoshi, and I know they're just going to do an excellent job with the center. And under the direction of Dean Dan Clay, I'm just really excited that we can form this partnership in Iowa to really provide a good mental health infrastructure for the students in the state. So I'm really excited to be here. And I want to tell you a little bit, too, about being a couple and family therapist and what I think that means, because it's going to set the stage for what we're going to talk about. So when people think of couple and family therapists, they think, well, you work with couples and families. And that's part of it. But couple and family therapy is actually rooted in systems theory. Right? So my work and my research and my teaching tends to revolve around the idea of systems. And that's what I want to talk to you all about today. So to talk about that, we need to kind of go back to where my systems journey started. This picture up here is of my grandmother, Elaine Bird, who I'll refer to as Nana. Nana was an educator in Ogden, Utah for 25 years. She was the Utah Teacher of the Year, and she taught English and worked with student government. And I still remember at her retirement, my mom and my aunts and uncles threw her an open house, and it was just packed with people. She had a real way to connect with people. And she did it through stories. Actually, there was times in high school when my friends and I would cut class, and we'd actually go over to Nana's house. She'd give us lots of sweets and tell us more about Shakespeare, about other authors than we ever learned in English class. She also ran an independent bookstore called Wise Bird Bookery. It's still there. And when I was younger, I would go and I would be able to be among the books, read the books. I would work there, which really meant just, put that book back, do that. But really, Nana wanted to inspire in me and in all of her kids and grandkids a love of reading and a love of stories. And that turned me into somebody who loved to read, to think about this stuff, and brought me to one of my favorite authors, E.M. Forster. So I'm sure there's a lot of people out here who have read Forrester, or English teachers out here who know a lot more about him than I do. But what I think is interesting throughout Forrester's work is this idea of connection. In his most famous work, Howard's End, that's kind of where this next quote comes from, which I think really kind of encapsulates what I think about systems and what drew me into systems thinking, right? Only connect. That was the whole of her sermon. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer. If you know the context for this quote, it doesn't really it has to do with more of what's going on between two characters in this novel, but throughout Forrester's work, he's trying to make these connections across systems, across political identities, religious identities, sexual identities, all of those different types of things. And when I read that, especially that piece that says, live in fragments no longer, I wanted to understand what it means to make those connections. Because I'd seen my grandmother do it throughout the years as a teacher. And that is kind of what set me on this trajectory. So I'm going to make a distinction between what I see as systems thinking and what I see as linear thinking. And my main argument today is that when we use systems thinking, we can create thriving families, classrooms, schools, and communities. And I'm going to juxtapose this against linear thinking, which we'll talk about first, because I think that juxtaposition is really, really important. Can you all cue up that video for me? And we're just going to watch the first, 30 seconds to introduce this idea. Or do I click it and will it play? Maybe? Nope. We'll give it a second. If not, I can tell you what it's going to be. For those of you who came and joined me yesterday afternoon, this is kind of the same analogy here. Okay. Well, so what this is, it's a really cute, short little video from Canada where they have people standing next to a river, and all of a sudden they see a kid floating in the river. And the person runs, jumps, grabs the kid out of the river, and pulls him back out. All of a sudden, there's another kid floating down the river. So what do? They run, jump, grab the kid, pull him out of the river. And then somebody finally asks, well, who keeps chucking these kids in the river? Right? And that's what I think is the difference between linear thinking and systems thinking. Linear thinking means we respond to the crisis in the moment. We see the kid in the river and we jump in to save him. Systems thinking is asking, who keeps chucking these kids in the river? What's going on upstream that's making these kids fall into the river? And how can we prevent that? How can we change the interactions that are occurring to make it so there's a different outcome? But before I get too upset on make the argument against linear thinking, I want to talk about when I think it's important. So this is an awkward picture of me that you can see. Drinking coffee in my favorite coffee place in Cedar Rapids, Lightworks, highly recommend. The reason I am drinking this awkwardly is because I had just broken both of my shoulders. Let me tell you about this event that occurred. About 4 years ago, I got a really bad lung infection, so my wife took me to urgent care, and they prescribed me some antibiotics. I took them that night, took them the next morning, went to work, came home, and only remember bits and pieces of the next 3 days. I'd had a severe allergic reaction to the antibiotics I was on. So severe that I actually had 2 seizures and dislocated and broke both of my shoulders. Now, in that moment, I think the worst thing my wife could have done is say, Let's think upstream. What do you think caused these seizures? What were the factors that really produced that? No, I'm really glad she called 911. I'm really glad the paramedics, some of the only glimpses I have is actually getting a mental status exam in the ambulance. And remembering, like, they're giving me a mental status exam, but I don't know who the president is. I don't know what day it is. How is this working? And then remembering waking up and saying, oh, you had another seizure in the ER. Luckily, they've stabilized you. Right? When it comes to that crisis, I don't want people to be thinking systems. I want them to think linearly. But when we think linearly, there's also another issue too. I talked about my broken shoulders. So when I seized so hard, I dislocated and broke both of them. But what were the doctors in the ER concerned with? Not my shoulders, which I'm grateful for. I don't actually use my shoulders a lot in my job. But they didn't notice that. And they stayed dislocated for the next 24 hours. Until finally my wife was like, he's still complaining about these shoulders, and a new nurse walked in and said, shoulders aren't supposed to look like that. Right, so when we're focused on a crisis, that can be really important, but when we narrowly focus on it, we can miss other things that are going on, even though we're thinking, oh, we solved the problem, oh, we solved the issue. Right, so linear thinking is important in a crisis, but if it's the only type of thinking we bring, especially when it comes to mental health, it's going to be problematic. Because what tends to happen is we have what I call perpetual linear thinking. So if we go back to that analogy of the kids in the river, if we get really good at solving the crisis, then what do? Oh, well, let's just build an infrastructure around this crisis. Let's make sure we have towers so people can spot the kids that are in the river. Let's make sure we have really great training around swimming so we can swim in the river. And then we're going to rescue all these kids. And it really, what I think, promotes something called toxic resilience. Or what we'll talk about in a little bit, resilience without resistance. So when we think about resilience, it's a really important thing to have as individuals, as systems, as communities, right? We're all going to face hardships. But what happens when we think linearly? All the time, we set up systems that perpetually need a crisis and then are asking us to adapt in ways that are actually pretty toxic. How many of you have ever been in a situation, a job, where they're saying, you need to do more with less? Right? Be resilient. And then you say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do more with less. And then what do they ask you the next year? You did such a great job. Congratulations on being so resilient. And now do even more with even less. If we just think linearly, if we just organize around crises, what happens? We develop this thing of, okay, if you're going to be a good part of this team, a good player, every time we throw something at you, you're just going to say, okay, yep, I can handle a crisis. And then, if you're really good in a crisis, eventually you're going to get promoted and you're finally going to say, oh, I need to change what's going on here. And then what happens? Well, you're really good at a crisis, and that's why the system promoted you and results in you just putting out more and more fires. So this is what I see as the problem of linear thinking. It's this idea that we have a crisis and a response. In my work as a couple and family therapist, often that's what people think about is what I do when they come to me. So yesterday in my presentation, I had like this imaginary couple sitting on two chairs that we talk to quite frequently. But they're going to come in and they're in crisis, but whose fault is it? It's the other person's. Like, you need to solve this crisis by getting the other person to change, right? You need to solve this. Actually, it's not my fault, it's their fault. Let me tell you why. And that back and forth is what happens. Because when we're in crisis, when we're stressed out, we're burnt out, we just want to solve the problem that's in front of us. So that's linear thinking. I want to talk now about what I see as systems thinking. Some of my PhD students are here today, and I always give them a heads up on this one. They're going to have to do their comprehensive exams, and in almost all of these exams, they're going to write something about what we call family systems theory. And so I always ask them this question: what is a system? And they can't really describe it. We say the word systemic, we say the word system all the time, but what do we actually mean by system? So let's introduce this concept because I think there's some important things we need to know. When we're talking about any system, we have three components. Elements, so the things in the system, interactions, what goes on between the elements, and then the purpose. And the purpose is what really the interactions are driving us towards. Sometimes you're going to say that a system has one purpose, but the outcome of the interactions actually show that it has a totally different purpose. So these are the components of a system. And systems that are that exist actually have these two other properties, which is important to understand as well: autonomy and adaptation. Now, autonomy is a little bit different than what we think about in terms of doing what I want to do or pursuing my own goals. Autonomy is about the interactions. For a system to have autonomy, it has to have interactions or processes that serve to generate and maintain the system. In other words, if the elements stop interacting, there's no system. But systems, in order to maintain their autonomy, need what? They have to be able to adapt. So when I think about systems, especially at 9 o'clock in the morning, I think about coffee. This is the second reference to it, right? So if you think about going to your local coffee shop in their drive-thru, you are going to enter a system. At the drive-thru menu, you're going to say, "Hi, welcome to Starbucks. Hi, welcome to Scooters," or "Hi, welcome to Lightworks," my favorite place in Cedar Rapids. And I think they should probably, I should have wore promotional material, gotten a little, anyway. There is going to be predictable processes that are going to generate and maintain the system, right? If you pull up to the drive-thru menu and you don't hear anybody, you're going to be like, "Hello? Hello?" If they don't interact with you, you in that system are no longer there. So they have to say, "Oh yeah, hey, welcome to Scooters. What can I get you?" "Well, I would like a cafe au lait with a little bit of vanilla." "Okay. Great, it'll be $3.50 at the window." I drive up, I know what my interactions are going to be. They're going to say, "It's $3.50, I'm going to give you my card." But what's going on in the interactions behind the scene that I'm not seeing? Well, they have specific processes that lead to certain interactions that generate and maintain the system that give it its purpose: to give me caffeine and to make them money. So when we talk about a system, we are talking about systems that have these autonomy-generating processes. But if any of you go to Starbucks, you'll know that with the supply chain issues, some of these Starbucks have had to adapt. I pull up and I say, "Hey, I would like a strawberry acai refresher. Actually, because of supply chain issues, we can't get that for you. Would you like something else?" The system has to adapt to forces that are in its environment. If it doesn't adapt, what happens? It makes it so the system can no longer survive. So I want to talk today mostly about how to think about systems. And I think this is important because we are often trained to think linearly. There's a problem, there's a crisis, we're going to address that crisis. And then we get rewarded for that, right? Even though that's a system. Oh, you got the crisis, you fixed a crisis, congratulations. Here's a cookie. But when we can slow down and think about systems, I think we can create better spaces for ourselves and for all of those in the community. So I want to talk a little bit about the first way I like to think about systems is thinking upstream. And this is kind of about that river analogy, but I want to dive in a little bit more. So this little nugget here you see with the crazy hair is my 17-month-old son, Keenan. And he's kind of a crazy little goober. And, you know, I'm in charge of drop-off daycare in the morning. And there started, you know, at first when we took him there, he was really easy to drop off. He was having a lot of fun. But it started developing this pattern where I'd take him to drop off and he'd start to cry and be really stressed out. It wouldn't happen all the time, but there were days when it definitely did. I was like, what is going on? He used to be just able and ready to like get dropped off and be good to go. So I started thinking, what are the upstream? What's going on upstream that's leading to this outcome? And as I kind of watched in different ways of what was happening, I realized it didn't have much to do with Keenan, but it had a lot to do with me. If I slept in a little bit, didn't get up and give Keenan time to play around, crawl, like play with some of his toys, and then get him, he would get really stressed out. So if we woke up late, I got his clothes on really quick, I threw him in the car, I went to go drop off, that's when the crisis would happen. Right? If I was thinking linearly, what I would think, well, I just got to do something in this moment to make it better. But as now I've said, okay, if I want to have a good drop-off, if I want to avoid this crisis, I've got to take a few steps back. I've got to make sure that I'm getting up on time, giving him some space to crawl around, so when he gets there, he can feel settled. He can be ready to go with his day. A little caveat too, so my wife is expecting our second baby, and right now, she's finding out the sex of the baby, and she's told me she refuses to tell me until I get home later tonight. So maybe if you can convince Gerta to text her and let us know what it is, that would be great if we all find out together. But I'll keep you posted. The second story I want to talk about when it comes to thinking upstream has to, again, to do with my Nana. And this is one of the stories my Uncle Rick talks about when it comes to Nana. So when Rick was in high school, Nana was teaching high school. This was in the 70s. And one day, Rick was sitting at the table, and Nana came and sat down next to him and threw a bag of weed on the table. And my Uncle Rick was like, what? And Nana said, do you know what this is? And he said, yes. And she said, do you want to smoke it? He looked at her. No. Well, if you do, we can go smoke it together. Why did she do that? If you think about thinking upstream, my Uncle Rick already knew what weed was. And she wanted to make sure that there was an open dialogue about that, so if that ever became a problem, it wasn't something that was hidden. It didn't have to be hidden to become a crisis. The funny thing is anytime Rick would tell that story, we would turn to Nana and we'd say, so what did you do with the bag of weed? And she would never answer us. So thinking upstream allows us to think about what are the important elements and what are the interactions that are happening that create this crisis that's coming in front of us. When we think upstream, we're not thinking about just solving the crisis. We're thinking about, okay, how did the elements in the system interact? And how did those interactions give rise to the purpose of the system? So if we're going to think upstream, we also need to think downstream. So I want to back you up to the 1990s when I was in 8th grade. I wasn't a very good student. I was a decent student, but I was really good at procrastinating. One day, we got an assignment in my English class from Mrs. Palmer to memorize a poem. And I don't remember what day it was, but I woke up in the morning, and I said, "Mom, I'm supposed to have this poem memorized by 4th period, and I haven't even looked at it." She's like, "Okay, well, let's grab it. Let me help you. Jacob, why didn't you do this earlier? This is going to take a long time to memorize." It's like, okay. So I get there. My mom's reading this to me. I'm reading it back to her. It's still not memorized. I get on the bus. I'm still looking at it. I'm still reading it. I go to 1st period. I don't pay attention because I'm really anxious and nervous about having to memorize this poem and say it in front of the whole class. I go to lunch. I'm still doing that. It comes to 4th period, and Mrs. Palmer, our teacher, says, "All right, we're going to do this in alphabetical order by last name." Luckily, my last name is Priest. So one by one, the students in the class would get up and they would recite the poem. And I'm literally there with the paper, mouthing it along with them, like, "Oh my God, I'm not gonna do this. This is gonna be really bad. I'm gonna fall on my face." So finally, my friend Robbie Maurer, he got up, and I was like, "Okay, it's getting really close. I got 2 more." I get up there. I'm nervous a little bit, and I'm shaking. And I say, "Okay, you can do this." And it's like, "Invictus" by W.E. Henley. Making sure that was right. I was looking around. "Out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I think whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but I'm bowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the grate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." I sat back down and I said, what did half of those words even mean? And at that point, I had no idea. At that point, the only thing I knew is I had to memorize those things on that page in that moment. Now, my research as an education isn't in learning and education, so I don't know the stats on memorization and whether or not it's a good technique. But for me, because that was ingrained in me, it had some downstream effects. Anytime that I was in a stressful situation, that would be a place where I would go to think, okay, I can get through this. But it also led me to really understand who was W.E. Henley. What was his life experience and why was he writing that? It really kind of pushed my work into this idea of resilience and resistance. So when we think downstream, what we're talking about is how are we going to respond in a crisis, or how are we changing the system in a crisis, and what's going to happen as we get down the line? What is going to be the outcomes we expect and we want, and what are some of the potential outcomes that we don't think, that we need to prepare for? So in part of my role in the College of Education, I'm in the psychological and quantitative foundations part, and I lean way more to the psychological foundations than the quantitative. But I've had the chance to serve on a lot of these ed measurement and statistics dissertations. And the one I was on most recently was about devising more accurate ways to assess teaching outcomes. On these tests and all these different mechanisms. And I asked the student the question, how does this affect downstream? Are we making things better just for better's sake, and does better have some unintended consequences? When we think downstream, we think about the interactions in the moment and how it's going to shape the course of the river. So let's talk about zooming in and zooming out. So this is my wife, Chelsea. She was a journalist for the Cedar Rapids Gazette for a really long time, covering healthcare. She went back, got a master's degree in public health. And this story, this interaction we had really kind of illustrates our personalities, but also what happens when we just zoom in. So her mom bought her this nice new comforter for our bed for Christmas. It was a Kate Spade comforter. It was really nice. But as you heard in the introduction, we have 5 cats. 3 of them were chosen. The other 2 chose us after being born in our backyard. So this new comforter had cat hair all over it. I was like, okay, I'm just going to wash it. Sorry, y'all know where this is going. So, without thinking, what do? Throw it in the washer. It's a top-loading washer. You see how this is going to be problematic. Turn it on, I walk away, and then I come back an hour later to check it, and it's soaking wet. I've broken the washer. So I was like, hey, Chelsea, can you help me out? She's like, yeah. It's like, we got to lift this out of here. And so here we are, like, I'm not a very tall or big dude, and Chelsea's not very tall or big either. So we're like reaching down, trying to pull this thing out. And I looked to her, and I said, okay, let's stop. We've got to do this in a more meaningful way. She's like, are you really trying to therapize us pulling the comforter out of the washer? And for me, that's sometimes the trap we fall into in therapy, is we're zooming in and we're giving it really good language, right? It's really easy to, like, in the therapy room, okay, we don't want to change anything that's going on in the system. Let's just make you resilient to the system. Let's make you do it in a more meaningful way. Right? So when we zoom in on the problems, when we narrowly focus on them, and then we add this language around it, it doesn't actually solve the problem. There's no more meaningful way that we could lift, it doesn't change it. If I say, like, okay, let's do this with intention, that is not going to shift our ability to pull the comforter out of the washer. So what did Chelsea start asking me questions about? She started zooming out. So did you look about how this should be washed? Well, no. Did you think about potentially this outcome? Well, no. Do you think that there is a way that we could have avoided this possible outcome? Well, I do now. So, oftentimes when there is an issue or problem, we zoom in. We solve the crisis in the moment without thinking why the crisis is there. So it's really important to zoom out. When you think about systems, you're thinking about those interactions, but also the environment in which the system is embedded. We were, in the presentation I was doing yesterday, somebody brought up an example of somebody who was having a really hard time adjusting to being in this school and also was queer identified. How do you navigate that? Well, if you focus on the moment of just trying to get compliance, if you zoom in, what'll happen? Well, you'll figure out a way in the short term to solve the issue, but the issue will keep repeating itself. If we zoom out, we look at the interactions that are happening between that student and other students in those classrooms, between that student and the teachers that student interacts with, between teachers that goes on, that's leading them to potentially feel stressed out and not be able to deal with this, to the policies that are in place in the school, to the sociocultural factors that are going to structure power dynamics in these systems. So if you want to think about systems, you need to zoom out. You need to understand what are all of the interactions that are happening that would allow this outcome to occur. The more we focus on fixing the outcome, the more the system organizes itself around the problem or the outcome that we're having. So this is the important question. What can we do with this? Well, in a little bit, we've got enough time here, so I want to do this a little bit. If any of you are brave out there and are willing to let us practice some of this. I'm going to need 2 volunteers in about 5-10 minutes, so think about that. Give yourself some time to see if you want to be. This is being recorded, so if you want to be on a recording, think about that. But I'll be asking for a few volunteers in a little bit. So if we can think about systems, how do we change systems? Anybody ever gone to a new school and you're kind of, as a new person, you can step back and you can see everything going on? And you're like, oh, uh-oh, this isn't what I signed up for. And then when you tried to go and say hey, why don't we do something different? And what is that met with? You're new here. What do you know? We've been doing it this way forever and ever and ever, right? Creating systemic change is really difficult. When we try and shift entire systems, we're trying to change those interactions, and those interactions have often been occurring for a really long time. So let's talk about some potential ways we can do this. Whenever I enter a system, or a system comes into my therapy office, I'm thinking about these 3 questions. What interactions, rules, or patterns contributed to this outcome? What other systems shaped this outcome? And was this outcome the unintended purpose of the system? So what does that mean for me in the therapy room? If you have my imaginary couple come and sit down, they walk in, they sit as far apart on the couch from each other as possible. They don't want to look at each other, and they're not really happy about being here. And I'm going to say, all right, hey, I'm Jacob, give my little spiel. Tell me what brings you in here today. And typically you start. No, you start. Fine, I'll go. And then 9 times out of 10, the couple's gonna say, we have communication issues. I know a lot about good communication techniques. So if I would say, great, okay, well, we can fix this problem really quickly. All right, we're gonna start doing iMessages. Anybody ever heard of those? If you do an iMessage with a couple in your first session, it's gonna go exactly like this. I think that you are a jerk. I feel that you do not do anything around the house. Great, we just taught him great communication techniques. All right, you're good to go. No, but we have to think about the interactions, rules, and patterns. So, if we think upstream, how do they interact? What's their pattern of behavior that regardless of the topic, that they are going to organize themselves around? Right? Has this become so entrenched that it's now a pattern or a rule? And what's going to happen when I push against that rule? So if we think downstream, if I change this pattern of interaction, if I work with this couple to have a healthy interaction, what is going to be the downstream effects? We almost always think that, oh, it'll be good. Parents get along better, kids are going to do better. Do you know how many times I've improved a couple's relationship only to then see the relationship between the adult, one of the partners and their parents get more stressed out? Right? It's the unintended consequence of the system change. So I need to think downstream to be able to say, okay, this could happen, and how do we identify this? If I'm focusing on improving communication right now, what does that mean for, later on down the road for the outcomes that are going to be there? If I zoom in and focus on just the communication issues, it's going to make my job really easy, but they're not going to stick around for a couple more sessions because I'm not going to give them what they want. Right? Because the system wants me to say, okay, hey therapist, you have all this specialized training so you can tell us who the problem is. And if I fall into that trap, I'm like, all right, you are the problem, that doesn't help. So you have to zoom out. What are the other systems that are shaping this outcome? What are the other systems that these people are embedded in that shape this outcome? If you are in a really toxic work environment where they're saying, be resilient to all of this, What do you have when you come home? If you walk in the door and your partner's had a really stressed out day, do you have a lot of space to communicate well with them? If you have a parent who's suffering with a chronic illness and you are the primary caregiver, do you have a lot of space to communicate with your partner all the time? Right? If you are queer identified or have another marginalized identity, are you walking into spaces as you go about your world that are telling you you don't belong here? And are you carrying that with you? If I don't think about those systems, if I don't think about the other systems that this couple system is connected to in that moment, I'm not seeing what's happening. I'm not really going to help them create the space, create the relationship that they want. And then, was the outcome the unintended purpose of the system? If you think about interactions, they're going to have this pattern, and what you do is you think, okay, the interactions that I have are going to lead to this outcome, but the way I interact is actually predicting a whole other outcome. Right? The downstream effects of what I think this interaction in the moment is going to do is very different than what I actually wanted. So it's important to ask yourself, okay, how did this become the unintended purpose of the system? So then, what do we need to do? We need to be able to adapt our systems. So if we're going to connect, and I think it's important to think about connection not as only as like, oh, I have an emotional or a romantic connection, but connection is about kind of putting these pieces together. The first thing he says, Ian Forster talks about the prose and the passion. To me, I kind of interpret this in my head anyway, about this idea of resilience and resistance. To be resilient, you kind of have to be passionate about what you do. If you all weren't invested in education, it's probably pretty, you can't be resilient because in all systems there's problems. And if you were just to say, okay, whatever, I don't have any more passion about this, you're not going to be resilient to that. But also that prose, that boring structure, you have to sometimes resist it. When systems are too adaptable, when they're asking people to give up too much of who they are or putting too much pressure, they don't really sustain themselves well. So you need that ability to set clear boundaries. Often we think of boundaries as just no's. I will not do this, I will do this. But the other piece of it is that yes piece. I will do this. I can say yes to this and I can say no to this, but I have the ability to make those decisions for me. Toxic systems want to take that ability away from individuals. They want you to see that you have no other choice than to respond in the way the system wants you to. So you've got to meet those, you've got to have some resilience. When I have couples who are thinking about divorce and one partner doesn't want to get divorced, often they're telling me I will do whatever you want. I'll change, I'll be whoever you want. I was like, that's not going to give you the outcome you want. If you change who you are for this person, you're not going to be in this relationship the way you want to be. This other concept, live in fragments no longer, which is one of my favorite lines from Ian Forster. You have to think and connect these systems for the people you work with, for yourself. You have to think about, all right, how are all these different problems we're talking about, different issues we're talking about actually connected to each other? How are the policies in our school affecting the behavior of students? Or how have our inability to enact these policies in a way that is consistent and equitable affecting the way the teachers feel, affecting what the students think? If we don't connect all of the issues that are going together and see how they are all parts of systems, we're going to miss out on opportunities to create real change. One way to always think about this is, we talked about what is a system, elements, interactions, purpose. One system elements are often, systems in and of themselves, right? An individual is a system, so all of the individuals in a classroom are actually elements of the classroom system, but also systems in and of themselves, right? And systems replicate in, out, back, and forward. And then when we can kind of bring all of these fragments together, you can rob life of its isolation. What do I mean by that? The best way for people to feel scared, alone, fearful, is to feel like it's only them. That nobody else is going to be there for me. At the heart of that couple that I see in therapy, that's the fear they're really sitting in. So as we form relationships, and as we create space for people to bring their whole selves into relationships, into systems, they get better. Now, the caveat to that is oftentimes when people say, rob life of its isolation, it's you have to agree and accept me 100%. If I'm going to bring my whole self here, there's no room for disagreement. But actually, when we bring our whole selves here, we can actually have conversations across differences. And that can really make a big change. If you don't know this, therapists, we also go to therapy. And my therapist, Anne, who has since retired, but I worked with her for 4 years, she was great. And she told me a story about robbing life of its isolation that has stuck with me forever. Her parents grew up in Iowa in the 1920s and 30s. And they fell madly in love when they were in their early 20s. But never got married until they were in their late 30s. And she said, why did this happen? Well, my mom was Catholic, and my dad was Lutheran. And their parents said, hey, you don't marry somebody who's Lutheran, you don't marry somebody who's Catholic. And so they had to learn how to love across that difference. It took them 18 years to be able to say, I want to be connected to you, but I am not going to change who I am. That means that there's going to be parts of me that I know you may not be able to support as much as I would like you to. But if we can build a mutual understanding, if we can bridge that gap, we can be connected to each other in the way that we want to be. Anne told me, therapists are always wary when you tell them that your parents had a great relationship or your parents were perfect. You say that to your therapist, they're going to be like, okay, well, let's talk about that. But she said, you know what? Because they learned to love across this difference, and because it took them 15 years to end up together, they had one of the strongest relationships that I've ever seen. They were able to not only be resilient when problems came, but they resisted the urge to give up who they are to do what the system or the relationship told them that they should do. So when you adapt your system, it's really about connecting the systems together, bringing yourself, but allowing space for others, and forming and understanding how all of these systems are going to interact together to shape what's going on. So I told you I'm going to want some volunteers here. Because I think as you can see, most of my examples have been from therapy, right? I teach courses, but it's typically to undergraduates or graduate students in college, and that may not all apply there. So I'm wondering if anybody's got a good hypothetical situation that they want to come up here and tell us about, and if somebody else wants to come up too, I need 2 people. I want us to talk through this, how we could think about an issue or a crisis and work through it. Any volunteers? Come on up. We got one. We need one more. Oh, yep, come on. Thank you. Yes, give a hand for our volunteers. All right, we got Nathan.
Yes.
Awesome. Joe? Perfect, thank you, Joe. So I've got microphones for both of you. Do either one of you have a hypothetical situation we can talk about? Okay, good.
I'll leave it to you.
Okay.
Here, we come up here. It'd be a little bit easier for...
So here's my hypothetical.
Okay.
I've got an 18-year-old son at home who has schizoaffective disorder and doesn't want to go to school.
Whew. Okay. All right.
I know it's specific, but it's very hypothetical.
Yeah, very hypothetical. Okay. So let's talk through this. Let's think about first, and I'm going to have us work through this here. So, do you want to be the son at home who doesn't want to go to school?
Sure, why not?
And you want to be mom?
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk through this. So start out, get your son to go to school.
Knock, 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 knock. Bedroom door's locked. It's time to go to school, Nathan. Are you up yet?
No.
Knock, knock, knock. The door's not quite open. Is there something you want to do here to fix that?
Not especially, no.
Knock, 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 knock. Nathan, I have got to be to work in 20 minutes. It takes me precisely 18 minutes to get to work. The door is not open, therefore I cannot get you out of bed so that you can go to school so I can go to work.
This is very realistic, by the way. No, not today. Not feeling it.
Pound, pound, pound. Nathan, get your lazy out of bed. Hence the problem.
All right. This is a great example. All right. So let's start by... Yeah, give it. Yeah.
Good job, man.
Thank you.
What's the issue? All right. So let's say we solve that issue of we got Nathan out of bed. Does that solve the problem? Get your lazy out of bed. Okay, Nathan gets out of bed, goes to school, has a miserable day, comes home. What's going to happen the next morning? And then is Joe going to be happier or more frustrated that, oh, great, you went to school one day. You know what? Let's take this day off. You stay in bed. It'll be great. But as Joe forces Nathan to go to school, what's going to happen?
I'm just so done with this. Either go to school or drop out. Figure it out.
Right? Yeah. It's going to become an ultimatum crisis. You are going to do this or you are no longer going to do this. Right? You're going to either go to school or you're not going to live here. So if we zoomed out, let's go out one level. What else is happening in this family's world that's important for us to know?
He's got schizoaffective disorder.
Okay.
I have to go to work.
You have to go to work.
We didn't say if I have a partner or not in this.
You can make it up. It's okay.
I think that in this scenario right now, I'm the only one yelling at Nathan to get up, so I probably don't have a partner. I'm frustrated. I'm probably overstressed. If I'm a single mom and I've got a kid with disabilities, that's going to add to it. Maybe I have a toxic job. I don't know.
Right? So if we're zooming out here, looking at Joe, embedded in the system where she feels isolated. Embedded in a work culture that says, hey, just do more with less. You got this. You're resilient. We got this. Okay. So Nathan, tell me about your systems.
Well, there's a lot at play. So if someone has schizoaffective disorder, they're already dealing with not fully being understood maybe by the general public. And so if you go to school and you already are susceptible to mood issues, then now you're dealing with being predisposed probably to not being in a good mood, so you've already ruined the day, or together have ruined the day for both people involved. And then also the defiance. I mean, I can see I don't necessarily have schizoaffective disorder, but I know personally that if someone is defiant towards me, it's very easy to, or isn't understanding, it's easy to mirror that and reflect that backwards, back to them.
And you were probably up all night playing video games anyway.
Probably. I mean, that could be true in
Right?
real
So,
life, but, you know.
so that's how we're zooming out a little bit here. What else goes on at school for Nathan? What else is in that system that's important for us to know?
He might not have friends. He might have remedial classes. He might be struggling with some skill issues in classes and pro-social behaviors versus adaptable social behaviors. Then maybe there's a tic or something that makes it very visible and kids can see and treat him differently.
So how could let's just focus on the moment, the interaction. What is the downstream outcome we want?
We want him to graduate from high school.
We want to graduate from high school. How does the interaction that happens between Joe and Nathan help that outcome? Does it? I think Joe's probably thinking, yeah, if I can get this kid to get to school, he's going to graduate. The more she focuses on getting that kid to school, the more what? The odds of graduation are going to go up or down? They're going to go down, right? If you continue to narrowly focus, if you continue just to try to move the comforter out of the washer more meaningfully, it's not going to change the outcome. All right, so what upstream interactions happen between Joe and Nathan? What are some, let's just, again, we're going to make this up. In other words, what happens the night before, 2 days before, that results in the 8 o'clock in the morning knocking on the door?
That might be the family dinner where we sit down and talk about what the plan for tomorrow is. Let's get that ready. Let's have our clothes out. What are you going to wear tomorrow? How are your classes going to go? What are you doing for English tomorrow? Da, 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 da. And then making that plan, setting that visual schedule, making sure the clothes are in a visual space. We're probably going to remove the lock on your door, just saying.
Yeah, well.
But we might have like a shut off for video game time and like a tuck in, check out before bed, and then the plan for the next morning.
Right.
But it may even include going further back and maybe having weekly meetings and weekly just chat sessions on how things are going at school.
Right, so yeah, I think these upstream things that could be different. If I just focus on getting you out of bed every morning, the likelihood of you doing that is not going to happen. But if I figure, okay, hey, this is an issue, let's take a step back. Let's say, okay, how can we structure these interactions a week in advance? How can we create the type of relationship we want that I have some influence to say, you can trust me?
Can I ask a question,
Yes.
actually? So, I mean, we all here, I assume, are pretty open to these ideas of being, and I hear a lot like compromising too, and making sure that things work for all the systems involved. But how do we get other people who aren't as open-minded and are so stuck in their ways to
They're
see it that
not
way?
bought in.
They're not bought in. That is an excellent, and we talked about this yesterday when we talked about conflict, if you were there, right? What is the purpose of conflict?
To have discussions so that we can see where the systems are broken.
Okay, so to have discussions to see where the systems are broken. But when we have power imbalances in our system, the purpose of conflict is often just to maintain the power imbalance. Right? So is it about often compromising? I actually don't ever talk to my couples or when I do larger systemic work about compromise. Because nobody really buys in. You know, there's some things you can compromise on, but it's not like, okay, let's have a compromise. You go to school half the time and then you can stay home half the time. It's not going to be a good compromise. So it's about understanding why the conflict is there, why the system needs the conflict. How is it maintaining a power structure? It may be that if Nathan goes to school stressed out every day, it allows that teacher to say, oh, see, this isn't on me, this is his fault. And so I'm not even going to deal with this. I've tried, I'm out.
Or the mom.
Or the mom, right? Or in the larger context too of like, okay, we've just got to put all of this time and attention in fixing this crisis right here and getting Nathan to school. But can we work out a compromise? No, because there's not a compromise. But what can we do is we can listen to Nathan. Oftentimes, the way systems maintain power is trying to shut down the other voice. No, you don't have a say in whether or not you want to go to school. if you want really that space, that connection in the system, Nathan can say, I don't want to go to school, and then you can say, well, tell me why. Let's talk about that. When I do that, that doesn't mean I'm changing what I want to have as the outcome. It doesn't mean I'm changing my opinion that Nathan should not go to school, but it does mean that I'm creating space in the system for other voices and for others to be empowered. If the person in the system just wants to keep, conflict really benefits systems that are, want to maintain the status quo. But if you can see the conflict for what it is, and you can create space whereby you're not necessarily scared to hear what the other person has to say, or you're fearing that saying that will result in you having to change, you're going to stay in the same way. That system's going to keep replicating itself.
Is that the same thing as saying, like, if somebody's having an emotional outburst and then you give emotion right back, that's the toxicity playing off?
Right? Like, hey, I'm really stressed out. Oh, you're not as stressed out as I'm stressed out, right? It's like, that's not what I wanted. But it allows me to say, oh, you can't complain in this relationship because I'm the one that has the power to enact who gets to complain and who doesn't. Right? Because what's going to happen across time is this is going to become a patterned behavior. And knock on the door, get out of bed. No. Right? It's going to become a pattern. But we also need to think downstream. If we get this plan when we're thinking upstream, we're zooming out, we're looking at all these different connections, and Nathan starts to go to school consistently, we're going to assume there's only positive effects from that. But that might not always be the case, right? What if Nathan is just starting to feel really safe and secure in his school, then all of a sudden there's a policy enacted that throws that all up in the air? Well, all of that work could be potentially wiped out unless we're thinking about that possibility and preparing for that potentiality. Right? If we're thinking linearly, we're focusing on the crisis in the moment, pulling Nathan out of bed, pulling him out of the river, and getting him to school. And then what do we want to do typically? Let's build the whole infrastructure around the crisis. Let's not think about how we can have these meetings, how we can build a relationship, how we can slow this process down in order to connect all of these pieces together. Other questions, other thoughts?
I think it just takes an open mind, honestly. And coming from someone who doesn't necessarily work directly with psychology, I work more on in the other areas of things. I think I can see this. This is not just limited to psychological things. It's everywhere.
Yeah, no, I think all systems share these properties. Mm-hmm. And if we think about only the outcome, we miss out. Let's give a round of applause to our wonderful Sure, now you have to. Oh, I want to read it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's a girl. Oh, no. Oh, that's exciting. Carrie, you're too wonderful for doing that. Actually, the thing is, too, is I'm sending the link to my mom to watch this, so she'll actually find out after y'all do. Sorry, Mom. In the few minutes we have left, I kind of want to circle back to this broader picture of kind of, I think, what we're trying to do here together. I think that the Iowa Center for School Mental Health has this vision of connecting all of these disparate systems that are going on out there, right? Is there going to be crisis response? Yes. The next crisis in your school, in your classroom, the interactions that are going to facilitate that have already started. And we're going to need to be able to jump in the river and help these kids out of the river sometimes. But what I love about conferences like this is we start to make connections. we start to say, oh, what are you doing? And I'm hoping that the infrastructure and I, with the leadership that is in there in the Iowa Center for School Mental Health, I think it's going to be incredible. To be able to build this infrastructure, to have systems talk to each other, to learn what the other people are doing, to not live in fragments when it comes to social and emotional and behavioral health across the state of Iowa, but really create a system that can help students, that can help teachers, that can help schools thrive. And I think that, we talked about this idea of only connect, and that's what I love about bringing us together. We need to connect with each other. Because as we're invested in social, emotional, and behavioral health, if we all work together, if we're all examining these systems, if we're all zooming in and zooming out, thinking upstream and downstream, we can save lives. We can help people, help students thrive. And that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. My time is up. I don't think we really have too much time for questions, but I'll be around up here if anybody wants to chat. But I really want to thank you. I really appreciate your time this morning. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're invested, and have a great day at the rest of the conference. Thanks.